the study there with a little graphic that you have with regard to the books of the Bible. We'll probably throw this back up on Sunday night, back up on the screen. What I wanted to do here is, especially for the younger believers that haven't been around the terminology of the books of the Bible in their collective sense, in their groupings. We have several here, and they're very, very important. For example, the first grouping of the first 5 books of the Bible is called the Law. If I would ever say the Law of Moses, or the Bible would say the Law of Moses, it is referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. It's also called the Pentateuch. That's its Greek name or assigned grouping, meaning the 5 books of Moses. These are all here: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All of these books were written within a 40-year period and actually cover a 40-year period of human history. The founding of the Hebrew nation and their bringing out of the Egyptian bondage and bringing to the land. Now, at that point, there are 12 chapters, by the way, in here that deal with Gentiles, but the rest has to do with Israel. And all of the books cover better than a 2,500-year historic period, though they were written covering a 40-year history period. The reason I say that is the first 12 chapters of Genesis take us from Egypt all the way back to Adam. Okay. Now, the next grouping that we have, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the 2 Samuels, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are called history. Now, whose history? The Jew. From the time that Joshua takes them into the land, all the way to the last 3, and these are known as people who served in the post-exilic period. What does that mean? Exile. Daniel and Ezekiel were exilic prophets. They lived during the exile. There were others like Isaiah and so forth, Jeremiah, that were pre-exilic prophets. They prophesied before the Babylonian exile. Others during, others lived afterwards. So, all of these are a history of the nation of Israel. Basically, historic books. So Joshua takes the people into the land, and it covers a period of about 26 years. Then we have over 300 years covered with the Judges. Now, the difference between Joshua and Judges is this. Joshua is one man taking the whole nation into the land and divvying up the land by lots for these tribes. The Judges has to do with one man over one tribe, judging that particular tribe for God. For example, who in the book of Judges was the judge over Dan, one of the worst tribes? He was the strongest man in the Bible. Samson. He was a judge. Othniel. Deborah. We had a Gideon speaker. Who is Gideon? He is a judge. When did he live? During the time of the Judges, after Joshua took the people in. There were 12 judges covering a period of better than 300 years. Ruth lived during the time of the Judges. The Samuels, Kings, and Chronicles cover the time between Saul, the first king of Israel, David, the second, Solomon, the third, and then the kingdom split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And on we go. Those are covered in these 3 historical books. Now, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Ezra and Nehemiah have to do with the 2 groups of people who come back after the exile. What did Nebuchadnezzar do to the temple and to the city? Destroyed it. Ezra, Psalms 119, who was the one who wrote, as a young man, he was taken on that trail of tears from Jerusalem there to Babylon. He lived during the exile, and he asked the Persian kings with Nehemiah, send me back to rebuild the city and the sanctuary. So Ezra and Nehemiah represent those groups of people that come back. Zerubbabel was part. He never wrote a book, but he's mentioned in their books. What about Esther? Esther is part of the group that stayed. And she married a Persian king. She stayed in Babylon after the exile. How did she get there? She was born and raised during the exile and was a young, beautiful woman who stayed there after the exile. That's Esther. But that's all part of the Hebrew history. Okay? Now, the Hebrews also have a section called the poetry or wisdom or praise or singing section. For example, many of the songs were nothing but the national hymn book of Israel. They'd open it up and they had words and notes and music to sing. In fact, many of them were put to a lyre. Now that's not L-I-A-R, that's L-Y-R-E. And we get the word lyrics from words and notes put to a lyre. All of that comes by way of psalms. So that is their poetry or their praise or wisdom literature. And they include Job in that, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Now here's an interesting thing. The book of Job takes us from the depths of woe and degradation to a man who was totally bankrupt, even with his health, to a book that's one of the seamier books, the Song of Solomon, one of the X-rated books of the Bible. It is steamy. So from the depths of degradation to the heights of human pleasure in a love relationship. But that's how they group them together. Psalms indicates more praise, Proverbs wisdom. Ecclesiastes was written by a man who said, I've done everything in life and nothing's worthwhile. Until he found out that living for God was the only thing that lasted. And so it starts off with vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is the guy who had everything. Okay, two more groupings. Let's see our time here. With the 39 Old Testament books. Now, another thing you have to keep in mind with these next two sections is that there are 5 books that are called the major prophets. Actually, the Lamentations was written by Jeremiah. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. Why? Because every time it's a drop of a hat, he's pulling out his hanky crying. He was brokenhearted over Israel. He's called the weeping prophet. Of course, a lot of things happen to him that make you and me cry as well. But Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are the 4 major prophets. Why are they different than the minor prophets? Does it mean that they're of a minor importance? No. It's just that they wrote more with regard to a volume of work with regard to Israel, her kingdom, and the future. For example, who is the number 1 kingdom prophet? Isaiah. You just go to his book, and all 66 chapters talk about the kingdom and the Messiah and what's going to happen and the curse removed and the lion and the lamb together and on we go, the Gentiles coming and what they're going to do in the kingdom. Jeremiah basically writes that Jerusalem is going to be taken into captivity. Daniel reads Jeremiah, which means it was written before, and figured out from Jeremiah that he was going to be here in Babylon how many years? 70 years. The length of the exile or the Babylonian captivity. Lamentations is he's the weeping prophet. He's writing over his broken heart for Israel. Ezekiel has to do much more with the future millennial kingdom, and then Daniel has to do with the tribulation period. Those are major works of major import. But that doesn't make the minor prophets any less important. But the minor prophets did something a little different. Some of these minor prophets, as with the judges, addressed their message to one of the two sections in Israel. What did the judges do? They ruled basically over their own tribe. Sometimes they had an effect over all the land. But whenever Jesus told Peter, you're going to sit on 12 thrones doing what? Judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Each judge had a tribe. So it was more local in their rule. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are more collective for the two nations. In what book do we find Israel being two sticks made one, two flocks made one? Ezekiel. You see, I'm going to gather all Israel back to the land. But we have Amos. He was a northern kingdom prophet. Hosea, a northern kingdom prophet. In other words, he was sent basically to the 10 northern tribes. Jonah was sent to the 10 northern tribes. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because Jonah was sent to where? Nineveh. And Nineveh was a city of what country? Assyria. What country, several years later after Jonah, what country came and took the 10 northern tribes from the land back to it? Assyria. Jonah didn't want to go to Assyria. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. Those Gentiles up there, they're rough and cruel. They hate the Jews. And God says, you're going to go. I'm not going to go. The whale's belly story, he brings him up on the land. And where does Jonah go? To Nineveh. All right? What happened? Nineveh repented. There were people there who believed in God, and God spared the city. But it too later on became corrupt. And what peoples then? Rather than the Jews sending back missionary evangelists and pastors to make these people grow, what do? They let them go. They show their hatred. Jonah dies. And the Assyrians come back under Sennacherib and take the 10 northern tribes. Now, one other thing about this. The Syrians then say, hey, these 10 northern tribes were so easy, I'm going to go get the 2 southern tribes. The only problem was that Isaiah and Micah were in Jerusalem teaching the word of God, and Hezekiah was a godly king. And they said, we're going to take, remember Rabshakeh? He said in the Hebrew tongue, everybody understood. They said, no, speak in the Assyrian tongue. You're scaring everybody. Nope. He spoke in the Jewish tongue. And they said, we're not going to give in. We're not going to let you take Jerusalem. And that night, Rabshakeh went back to his camp. And they had 185,000 Assyrian soldiers who 100 years before or better was evangelized by Jonah. They trusted God, but they forgot him and went back to their old pagan ways, came down and took the 10 northern tribes who were ungodly, but the 2 southern tribes remained true. And what happened that night? Jesus Christ paid a visit to the Assyrian camp that Jonah visited 100 better years before. And he killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. That's how it all gels together, you see. And the rest of the so-called minor prophets were sent to the 2 southern tribes, having messages for them, because the 2 southern tribes eventually apostatized. And we only have a few people, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Ezra, and others, who were taken up as a remnant to Babylon.